1, 2. Oh, there we are. Okay. We are live. Good morning to everybody. There's more fish people than I thought there would be. I'm very gratified at that. Do you like to eat them, watch them, think about them, catch them? That's always fun. I certainly grew up. My grandfather taught me how to fish, and that was one of the greatest pleasures. And I spent so many hours as a very young kid just sitting on a Florida canal, catching a fish or two. My dad was not at all a biologist. I took him fishing with me once, and we were using these little live shrimp. And I put the hook through the live shrimp, and my dad said, "Oh, don't do that." So I went fishing alone after that. So fishes of the Caribbean, the Caribbean or the Caribbean. This is a Smithsonian Journeys lecture, inspiring generations. What sharks are dangerous? One way to find out whether a shark is dangerous is make him open his mouth and look at the teeth. The nurse shark, very common in the shallower waters. You can find them sitting in caves, asleep. And if you open their mouth, they have these beautiful flower-like teeth. They're good for holding on to stuff like shellfish and things like that. And they can cut your skin, but they can also leave a big monkey bite behind if they decide to attach. As a cruel teenager, a friend of mine and I, we caught a little nurse shark off of Fort Lauderdale, and we were playing with it on the beach, tossing it to each other, and it grabbed him by the bicep, and it wouldn't let go. And he ended up with a really nasty bite and a monkey bite on his bicep. But they can't do any real damage to you. The lemon shark is one of the more aggressive shark species in the Caribbean, but they're not really adapted for cutting pieces off of things. The tooth in the upper jaw and the lower jaw, they're long and pointy. That means for hanging on, not for slicing. They can certainly take a slice. Those edges are sharp, but that's not the forte of these teeth. But they can scare the heck out of you, I'll tell you. Blacktip reef sharks, now they're getting a little better at cutting things off. If you look at the edge of the upper jaw tooth, it begins to look like one of those Jinsu carving knives, a serrated. This is for cutting off pieces. Now, blacktips, to me, they act a little bit like dogs. They're nothing to really be afraid of, in my opinion. They're usually up in the shallow area of the reef. But there's also a migration that takes place in January to March off of, this is taken from an airplane off of Boca Raton. You say, well, what the heck is that? Each of those little spots is a blacktip shark right near the surf line off Boca Raton. And this guy counted 12,000 blacktips migrating past Boca Raton, migrating in January to March, migrating south to South Florida. Amazing. The Caribbean reef shark, this is the one that you frequently see out on the deeper reefs, very nicely adapted for cutting with these serrated edges. Also the lower jaw, serrated edges on those teeth. So a practical bit of information for you. How do you know if a shark is getting mad at you? You know, you can't just go up and look at his teeth and see whether or not he's gnashing them. But you can tell with the gray reef shark and with the hammerheads. They go through a dance. Notice his fins on the side, the pectoral fins, are held down like this rather than out like that for swimming. He's contorting his body and swimming in this exaggerated S fashion. Barracuda do this same thing, the same little dance when they're getting angry with you. These reef sharks can be territorial. If you're coming into their territory, especially if the reef is behind them and you're kind of crowding them up against their reef, they'll start doing this dance, and that's when you back off. Now, to prove that this was a threat display, this was now in the Pacific at Eniwetok Atoll. Two of the researchers who had this little two-man submarine, they said, okay, we're going to prove it. So they went up to a shark making that dance, and they kept going right straight toward him, kind of forcing him into the reef that was his territory. He quit the dance, came out, grabbed the submarine, bit the propeller off, and we are now believers that this is, in fact, a threat display. The shark that is more trouble in the Caribbean is the bull shark. And you can see why. Look at these teeth. Look at these cutting edges. Fantastic. These are responsible for most of the attacks, dangerous attacks on humans in the Caribbean. That's enough of that. Fish. Reef fish start out, almost all species of reef fish start out as an egg. The egg may be attached to the bottom or floating in the plankton. As they develop, they get this beautiful reflective eye. The tail is curled up in here, and you can see a sac of yolk. So he's getting near the time to hatch, at which they break out of their egg. At this point, they are just the flimsiest of individuals. They're transparent bodies. You can see a bladder here full of air to help them float. A little bit of yolk left in this one, but very little. And their mouths are these tiny little things. There's very few plankton that they are good at eating. It's one reason that it's difficult to have aquaculture of especially marine reef species. The larvae are so delicate and difficult to find the correct food supply for. So their meager jaws can handle food. They can swim against the currents. Recent research finds they can even smell and hear the location of a reef and swim toward it. And when they get then to a reef where they can settle out, then the troubles begin. You've got to find a place to hide right away. These new fish that arrive on the reef, they're cannon fodder. Almost everything on the reef can eat them. Some of the champions are the angler or the frogfish. These guys are fantastic in that the first spine of their dorsal fin is modified into a bait that they can shake out like this and trying to attract a little fish to them. Now, you've got to have really good eyeballs to watch this little film coming up. So here's an anglerfish who looks like a plate of pasta. And there's a little fish who likes pasta. Now watch closely, very close. Look, oh, and there's this beady little eye. That's the only way you can really tell that's a fish. And anything that gets anywhere near that mouth, it opens. It's a huge mouth, and all the water in front of him goes into his mouth, including any fish that are there. A lot of the other anglerfish aren't as well decorated, but they're beautifully camouflaged. Usually you can only just see the beady little eye here and a beady little eye there. A new arrival to the Caribbean, starting back in the 80s, is the Pacific fish, the lionfish. This was released from aquariums, undoubtedly. It didn't go through the Panama Canal, that's for certain. It was released from aquariums, and the red lionfish has thrived throughout the Caribbean. Now, in the Pacific, on tropical reefs, these are not uncommon at all. There's not as many as we see in the Caribbean, but they're an inhabitant of the reef. Usually they just sit around, wait for a fish to come close to it, and they almost hypnotize it like this, and then gobble it up. On the reefs in the Caribbean, they're swimming around like a flotilla. All the little fish just ignore them, and as they swim along the reef, they gobble, 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 taking the little fish from the reef. Now, when I first heard of this, frankly, I didn't believe it. That, oh, come on, not all the little fish are just going to ignore this big thing coming toward them, but that's what's happening. The amazing thing is that it looks like they just don't recognize it as a predator, which is odd. Some of them, well, they learn to recognize a little too late. That's the last thing they see. Well, they can reduce the small fish population by 80% in 5 weeks on a single reef. So 80% reduction in the small fish on the reef. One fish can eat 20 small fish in 30 minutes, up to 2/3 of their own size with that big mouth. So what in the world is going on? If we look at how they've spread, starting in '85 in Florida, amazingly, they got to Bermuda by the year 2000. But what's happening is they're being swept up by the Gulf Stream, and it took them much longer to get down south to the rest of the Caribbean, but they're there. So this is where they are. They're everywhere. There's no escaping them. This is the latest data I had, 2014. I talked to the guys and they said, oh, don't change the slide, George. You just add more of a red smear across all the islands. They're everywhere. Amazingly enough, they're up in some pretty cold water up here. I'm not sure how they're surviving up there, but they certainly are. I blame this a little bit on Star Trek. Jean-Luc Picard, who has that pet lionfish in the aquarium on the starship, and everybody wanted to have the same pet as Jean-Luc. And so you get it, you put it in your aquarium, and if you had any other fish in your aquarium, you no longer have any other fish in your aquarium because they ate them all. Well, why are there so many in the Caribbean but not the Pacific? What's going on? So it's been tested. Is there a parasite in the Pacific that inhibits the population growth, but it's not in the Atlantic? No, that got rejected. That's not true. It looks like predators in the Caribbean don't recognize them as food. Some of them are eaten, but largely they're not. Now, the lionfish has venomous spines. And so people say, well, once you eat one lionfish, you'd never eat another one. But I don't believe that, because when I have caught some large groupers, it wasn't at all uncommon to find stingray spines embedded in the roof of their mouth. Now, not just one spine that, oh, okay, I learned not to eat stingrays, a bunch of spines, some old, some new. So to take food, it looks like they're willing to put up with a fair amount of pain. Some of these Nassau grouper are eating the lionfish. And there was one paper that came out and went to a reef that had a lot of Nassau grouper and another reef that didn't have many Nassau grouper. And they said the reef with Nassau grouper had very few lionfish. Yeah, that's going to solve the problem. What they didn't know was the week before, they'd had a lionfish spearfishing tournament on the reef with the groupers. And so, oops, another little problem. The best predator on lionfish, look in a mirror. They are delicious. This is a lionfish spearfishing tournament. My nephew in Fort Lauderdale, who goes out for lobster and things all the time, they always take part of a dive to just spear some lionfish, take them home and eat them. As long as you avoid getting the spine stuck in your hand, they're very delicious to eat. So there's a whole program with posters out. How to catch the lionfish safely, how to prepare them, how to cook them. Eat exotic fish, save the earth. So more and more, at first people wouldn't eat them because they said, oh no, they got poison. I would ask guys down in the southern part of the Caribbean, so are you eating the lionfish? No, man, they're poison. The fish poison, you can't eat them. But they're learning now. The spines are poisonous, but the flesh is absolutely delicious. So hopefully the Caribbean will pass through this phase. Predators will learn to eat them, and other things will control the population. Parrotfish. These are the cows of the reef, if you will. They're an herbivore. They have a solid fused jaw that they use in order to chew on the reef, to eat the algae. At night, most parrotfish make a cocoon to sleep in. So if you look around this guy, this diaphanous thing around him is a mucus cocoon. So they put this cocoon out from their gills, and they essentially hide in the cocoon from chemically hunting predators like moray eels. And then in the morning, they eat a lot of this mucus. They don't waste it. So they eat the mucus and then go swimming on their way. Now, you may swim up to one of these. They can't close their eyes. Fish don't close their eyes. And you look at him and say, okay, well, his eyes are open, but he must be asleep, so it's no worries. I can get up right next to him. Don't do that. Because while they're immobile and they're seemingly in a stupor, they can see. And I did this once and went to really look at him, and he woke up all of a sudden, boom, knocked my mask off and left me feeling rather silly. There's the sound of a parrotfish feeding. Hear the scraping sound? When you're on a reef with parrotfish, you can hear this all over the reef. What they're doing is chewing off the algae and some calcium carbonate as well. Now, what you're watching here is the creation of beach sand. So parrotfish poo, a big parrotfish like that, can put out about 1/3 of a ton of finely refined calcium carbonate beach sand in a year. So if you're on one of these beautiful soft white sand beaches and you're lying there, at least if you're near a reef, part of what you're lying on is parrotfish poo. And you have now had the privilege of watching a parrotfish poo over and over and over. Okay, that's enough of that. Now, parrotfish were really fun scientifically because we knew a lot of species of parrotfish that had these beautiful colorations like that, all pretty good size, good to eat, but they were all males. We knew a bunch of other species that were usually smaller, very drab in coloration, but they were all females. People began to wonder, hey, well, something's wrong. You need girls and boys in the same species, except for one species I'll get to in a few minutes. And then finding out that, in fact, they're both the same species. That this was an initial phase, female, that could then sex change into being a male, a big, beautiful male. Since then, well, what happens? This is really amazing. So this is the ovary, a nice healthy ovary with eggs in various stages of development. All of a sudden, a, quote, decision, unquote, is made to change into a male. Within a week, that same ovary has changed into a testis. So here is perfectly viable sperm ready to fertilize eggs within a week. Massive changes. So what is going on with this? So again, here the female and the terminal phase, we call it terminal phase male. Imagine, if you will, that you're a big, beautiful female parrotfish. You can put out 10,000 eggs every 3 days. Now, in evolution, success is measured by the young that you foster, your number of young. So I'm a big, successful female. 10,000 eggs every 3 days. I'm big. All the males on the reef want to mate with me because I'm really hot. But hang on. If I could change sex into a male, I'm pretty big. I'm as big as those males that are mating with me. I think I could defend myself against them, compete with them, and fertilize 5 or 6 females that each have 10,000 eggs every day. Wow, what a success story that would be. Now, of course, they don't think about this as I just presented this analogy. We found out that what the important stimuli are, one, if they are dominated by many other males aggressively, that inhibits sex change. If there are very few other females around or larger females around, that inhibits sex change. Take away the aggressive domination by males and give them smaller females around them, and within an hour or so, a physiological decision is made. The brain has all of the behavior built in to be a male, and they can immediately change their behavior into a male. Now, they can't fertilize eggs for another 4 to 7 days, but they start spawning as if they could. It's amazing. So there's sex-changing fish all over the reefs. It was so common. I almost started working in graduate school on a species that was later found to be sex-changing, and we didn't even suspect it back then. And I'm so glad I didn't switch to that species, because I know maybe I would have discovered sex change, but I doubt it. I probably would have just gotten very confused as to who was switching the fish that I had in the aquaria. So the bluehead wrasse, the yellow phase, these are young, usually females. There are some males. These are going to change sex now rather drastically and end up being this beautiful terminal phase male. What happens with these, a student of mine working on these, and there would be a few of these males on the reef and a lot of the little females, and these males would in fact be defending essentially a harem of females. So he would then take that male out of the water, and within an hour or two, the largest female in the harem would start courting the other females. Now, she still looked like a female. She had no sperm, but they didn't know that. So they start responding to her, and within days, her coloration then changed into this terminal phase. So they go through this series of changes. Very soon, they get these little black spots after their behavior has changed, and now their color switches through this, and she becomes then a beautiful male who then courts the females on the reef. There's a lot of ways in which they do what we scientists call it. And one way, at least in this species, is pair spawning. These beautiful males will, in the afternoon on the leeward side of the reef, many of them will start swimming around excitedly. And if you see a wrasse like this, and they're really waving their pectoral fins like crazy as they swim around, that's courtship. So they're trying to attract females. They have a lek. So many of these males sort of next to each other in their territories, and the females come around and they look through and which is the hottest male, and then may decide to join up, in which point they go vroom up to the surface, sperm and eggs go out, and they separate. So no complex courtship. But if you want complex courtship, the Caribbean has the master of it all, the hamlets. This is a family of bass-like fishes, and they've solved the problem of sex determination in a very different way. They do it both at the same time. So every individual in these species is both functional male and female at the same time, truly functional hermaphrodites. Well, this presents a bit of a problem to them. So you don't want to fertilize your own eggs. This is not the most adaptive way to reproduce. You want somebody else's eggs. Now, in evolutionary theory, we think that eggs are more expensive to produce. They're bigger, they have a lot of energy in them. Sperm, smaller. You can produce a lot of those. So how do you then decide? So you go up to this other individual who is also a hermaphrodite. So they have to decide now, okay, who's going to do what first? And if you start watching these guys out on the reef, there's many different species swimming around, and they start to get a little snuggly, if you will, coming up close to each other. And this guy here, so they try to decide who's going to be the girl first, put out eggs, while I'm putting out sperm. Because you don't want to put out your eggs and sperm at the same time. You'll fertilize yourself. That's not right. So, okay, finally they come to some decision, and one of them says, I'm the girl. Puts out eggs, fertilizes the eggs, but now the guy who fertilized, he's supposed to reciprocate and put out eggs for the other one to fertilize. Imagine now you're a mutant Hamlet on the reef. You cheat. You have only sperm. You never make any eggs. So you travel around the reef and you trick others into being female first. Thank you very much. Fertilize your eggs and say, okay, where's my eggs? And you don't give any. You swim away. So you're going to be evolutionarily successful because you're investing far less energy. You never make eggs. You only make sperm. So how can you solve the problem to keep cheaters out of this system? And the way they've done this is by parceling. So these are more species, and here's two of them that are finally getting together, and I don't know which is which. One of them curls its tail around more. I think that's the one who is being male at the moment. But if you watch in the afternoon when you see these guys around, and these two are less colorful, but they start acting a little bit frisky and coming close to each other, and okay, and one just gave eggs, the other sperm. But well, it's hard to use she and he here, isn't it? The egg giver only gives a couple of eggs, just a small parcel of eggs, a very minor investment. And they get fertilized, and then she stands back and say, yeah, where's your eggs? So then it will put out a small parcel of eggs and fertilize, and then they trade back and forth, called egg trading. So this prevents cheating. If you're with a cheater, you put out a few eggs, he fertilizes them and swims away. At least you didn't lose much in the exchange. So it's a rather interesting way of deciding who is what. Remoras. These are fun animals. The top of the head is modified into a sucking disc. They use this to attach to large groupers, turtles, sharks, and it is such a strong sucking dish. If you catch one and put it on a hatch cover on the boat, as long as you lift the remora by its tail, you can open the hatch cover. But if you slide it forward, this suction cup releases immediately. So they go up, they suck onto the side of something, and as long as they don't swim forward, they're being pulled by the other one, you really can't release them. You can't release their hold. So it was thought that they were just hitchhiking to feed on scraps of food that were left behind especially by sharks. But then if you look in detail, by the way, when I see 2 or 3 of these guys swimming all by themselves, the first thing I'm wondering is, what were you attached to before I saw you, and where is it now? Thinking there's a big shark behind me. At any rate, if we look closely at their mouth, if they were adapted to feed on scraps, I would put the mouth down on the bottom, down here. But their mouth, in many species, is right up on the top, where it would be most effective at feeding on the side of the animal they're attached to. Because here's their sucking disc right here. So it turns out a lot of these are what we call cleaner fish. They feed on parasites attached to whatever they are attached to. So here is the lemon shark in the Caribbean. The lemon shark assume a pose on the bottom, and the remoras go right into their mouth and feed on the area of the front upper teeth of the shark. Now these sharks, this is a carnivore. They would eat fish like that, but evidently rarely are these remora ever eaten. They go in and they get a nice meal off the teeth of the sharks. Well, this is only one of many different species we know called cleaner fish. The neon goby, one of the most beautiful fish in the Caribbean, is the most common cleaner throughout the Caribbean. So here there's a swarm of them around this black grouper feeding on its side. They live on these coral heads. They'll be sitting on the coral, and fish will come up to the coral, and they'll pose or solicit the attentions of the cleaner fish. It's a very intimate relationship here, cleaning right on the eye of a Nassau grouper. So very intimate. So immediately, you look at this has to be a mutualistic symbiosis. The fish feeds on parasites, and the host fish, the grouper in this case, is rid of its parasites. So this was the story. In the bluehead wrasse, the yellowface, they're also a common cleaner in the Caribbean. In Hawaii, we have the most beautiful cleaner fish in the world, this wrasse. Its cousin through the rest of the Indo-Pacific, not quite as pretty, but very common throughout the Pacific as a cleaner fish. Well, when I got my PhD, the world was very excited. There'd been a proposal that these cleaner fish were responsible for some of the active fisheries areas. Fish would come in, visit the doctors of the reef, and the cleaner fish were probably responsible for the health of reef fishes. Okay, that's going to be great. And supposedly, cleaner fish would all have a special stripe coloration, sort of a gild coloration that would identify them. I'm a cleaner, come to me. Don't eat me, I will take your parasites. Oh, this looked like a lot of fun. So I had made a bunch of models of different shapes of fish and different kinds of coloration, and that's a little whimsical fishing lure up there. And the idea was, at that time, the science of ethology was really growing in Europe. I'll talk more about that tomorrow. But this was a common technique. So what are the important aspects of the shape and the coloration that lead a fish to recognize cleaners? Sometimes models don't work. In this case, it was amazing. This is the second hour that these fish had seen a model of a cleaner fish, and they went nuts. They would jostle with each other to get next to the cleaner fish. They would spend all day interacting with this cleaner fish. Hundreds of experiments later, we found they prefer the model of the cleaner fish to a real cleaner fish. And we were then looking at, well, what about parasite loads? Do they respond more when they have a lot of parasites? Nope, had no effect whatsoever. And this was really getting confusing until finally we tumbled to what was going on. When we tested which model did they prefer, these all worked just fine, including the fishing lure. In one of the experiments, I was looking at the video. We would automatically collect how long they spent with the model and videotape it as a second reinforcement. And we were looking at one, and it looked, oh my gosh, the model's gone. So there was just this piece of wire going back and forth in the aquarium, and the fish is sitting there, And of course, that revealed to us what's going on is tactile stimulation. Tickling, if you will, fish tickling. Boy, did I get made fun of in some areas when I started introducing this. But if you think about it, all vertebrate animals are rewarded by tactile stimulation from another person. Yakov last night asked us to tickle yourself and then tickle the person next to you. I don't know if anybody did that, but this is very common. So, in fact, all vertebrate animals are rewarded by gentle tactile stimulation. There's no difference in fish. A fishing method in the South Pacific and Northwest American tribes is to tickle for a fish. Just gently massage it and then grab it and pull it out. I have heard that it's illegal to tickle for trout in the northwestern United States unless you're a member of certain First Nation tribes, and then you can tickle for trout. I don't recommend sticking your hand into caves on the reef and looking for something to tickle to catch it. You might find something you didn't want. So we began looking close at how do cleaner fish interact with their hosts. And here's our cleaner in Hawaii. Now there's his mouth here. Now if he were swimming around the host looking for something to eat, I'd put my mouth next to the host where I could look for things. What he's actually doing, he's got his belly right on the host fish. Now on their belly they have two short fins, and they're usually down like this. When they come up to the host, they come out, and then so they go down the host like this, tickling the host. And you can see a fish swim by a cleaner, kind of ignoring it, and the cleaner comes out and starts doing this, and they kind of roll over in the water, and it really feels good. We went through a lot of experiments looking at, do they control the ectoparasites? And at least in Hawaii, one, we don't have too many ectoparasites in Hawaii, but the cleaner fish made absolutely no difference in the parasite load of the fish on the reefs. We'd remove them from some reefs and let them stay on the other reefs. We couldn't show any importance, ecological, physiological importance to cleaning. So, and here's the little neon gobies, and they flick their tail against the side of the host as they